There we go. Good evening, and thank you for joining us here on blackdoctor.org. I am Ellis Dean, the Director of Digital Programming here at Black Doctor, and this program is near and dear to my heart because this is a special pet project for me. Um, and you've seen it before. It's called Clinical Trials in Black Folks. And what we're talking about is clinical trials and getting more Black people involved in clinical trials. So, on previous shows, we've had uh, vice presidents of pharmaceutical companies on here. We've had vice presidents of hospitals come on and all types of people with fancy titles and fancy letters. But the most important people in a clinical trial are the actual participants. So for this particular show, we have somebody that's gone through it. Miss Selenay Mitchell is here, and she's going to share her story. So I really want you to pay attention, and as she goes through her stories and talks about how clinical trials impacted her life, as well as the lives of people that are in her family. And so, before we get to Selenay's story, a couple of things I want you to do. I see Gwen. Thank you so much. Number one, let us know where you're watching from. So drop that in the comment section. We like to know where people are watching us from all over the world. So please drop that in the comment section. Number two, if you know somebody that needs this information, make sure that you tag them or share this on your page. We want this to get this information out to as many people as possible. So tag a friend, share this on your page. Also like the program. Just click the like button. I like that too. Also, number three, if you have any questions, please drop those in the comments as well. We will answer any questions that you may have because this show is all about you and getting you to be comfortable and get you a clear understanding of what's going on. So, with that said, I know you didn't sign on to hear me drone on about all this other stuff. It's all about Selenay. So, welcome to the program, Selenay.
Hi, hello, Ellis. Thank you for having me.
And the first question is just, what is your story? How did you get involved in clinical trials?
So it basically it started. My mother, I'm originally from New York. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, and I was already living in Savannah, Georgia. The goal was for me to return back to New York and live with my mother. But my mother was maybe in her early 30s and she started getting sick and nobody could figure out exactly what was going on. She had really good insurance. She's in New York, so you would figure it's better doctors there. But basically, she couldn't work. Um, Her health really took a very large impact on her ability to work, maintain income for me. So she ended up um, leaving and coming to Savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time she got to Savannah, within a very short period of time, her health really deteriorated.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is like mid to late 80s. So I'm still relatively young. But I had to essentially take care of my mother, starting to take care of my mother from an early age. After we began being on our own and left other family, I started looking into ways to pretty much improve her life, find different types of food to eat, different diets, and I started noticing that there was this large disparity between the type of health care that we receive versus the type of health care that our counterparts receive. There's this disparity in the type of information that we're given versus the type of information that our counterparts were given. And my mother just happened to be blessed to find a facility with a doctor that wanted to essentially find programs for her. So he started introducing her. We're now getting into like the early 90s, and he started introducing to her to the very first time I'm start hearing what a clinical trial is, investigative medicine, experimental medicine, These are things that our counterparts were able, or not even just that, if you had the right size pocketbook, you were able to get that type of information.
Right.
So he gives her a list of a few doctors that can do various things, from drugs to various testing to either different treatment. And all of these, essentially, all of these programs are not in an area that is conducive to minority population. It now, you probably can get to those areas, but we're talking 91, 92, 93. It was kind of hard to really travel to those places. Um, and then it became an issue if she was to get in. They didn't realize the impact those trials had on a minority population. So she would get excluded from virtually just about every trial or any type of investigative drug treatment or therapeutic treatment, because they didn't realize that even though the inclusion and exclusion is necessary, of course, it's there for scientific protocol and, to make sure that the drug is manufactured properly. But the way that the drug is beneficial to white people, Asian people, is not the same thing that is beneficial to Black people, brown people, Latinos. Drugs don't even operate the same in men and women.
Right.
So, why would you wouldn't think that it would operate the same when it comes to different minorities. We, as minorities, especially as Blacks, we even are subjected to certain medical conditions. So with that happen, that just kind of put her on a lot of limited medication. Those medications never worked. The clinical trials never worked. And I was in school at the time. I have a degree in history, so research is kind of, that's my thing. I'm always looking for the solution to something. And we would find one issue, they would be able to control the hypertension, but then they weren't able to control the diabetes, or vice versa. Or the medication would bring a barrage of side effects that they didn't think would happen. And as time went on, and clinical trials started coming to different colleges, and people started, they started opening up clinical trial offices, like towards the latter part of the 90s. There wasn't really much that they could do to assist my mother and people that were like my mother, that were suffering from the same illnesses, because they didn't realize the population that we made up when it came to heart disease, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, sickle cell. The list just kept going on and on and on. And so, unfortunately, my mother did pass in 99, and from a lot of her complications. And she and many others who have suffered and who are now suffering with different illnesses, diseases, even rare diseases, is the reason why the clinical trials have expanded and evolved the way that they did and are continuing to do so. Because a lot of the trials actually didn't really start opening some of the things up until the early part of 2000. The first.
Well, let me stop you right here because I want to get a summary of what. So what's really happening, people that are watching, and thank you all, continue to put your cities in the comment section. What's happening is, she talked about in the early 80s, there's always been clinical trials. Clinical trials have been going on for a number of years. Every aspirin that you put in your mouth has gone through a clinical trial. Every procedure has gone through, any medication has gone through a clinical trial. Any FDA approved medication has gone through a clinical trial. Now, but what was happening is in the 80s and early 90s is they were in specific areas. And those areas were really had some barriers, whether real or they're really real barriers, right? If they put it in an area where it's a predominantly white, affluent area, to make it hard for people that live in other communities to get there. They put it, a lot of them on college campuses, predominantly white college campuses, which they were just pulling from the college students and not really, in terms of the clinical trials, and not really pulling from the communities or a diverse audience when it comes to being part of that trial. Yes, it was getting approved, and they had exclusions that were preventing people of color to really participate in those trials. Does that mean that those medications were ineffective? No, it doesn't mean that they were ineffective. But what that means is the dosage amount for women, the dosage amount for people of color might be different when it's effective, like taking it at night versus in the morning, can be different for genders and for people of color. And so that's the early stages post Tuskegee experiment kind of clinical trials that we're talking about. That's 1972 when the Tuskegee study was exposed. But post that time to now, they were still lagging behind in terms of getting more people of color involved in clinical trials. Go ahead, Selenay.
No, you said it perfectly. That's what I was going to say. Like, a lot of people don't realize that the devices that we use, even when the doctor tests you, everything has to be done in a clinical trial. And I wanted you made me remember a very good point. There were some trials that she was able to qualify for.
Okay.
And they were not in Savannah.
Okay.
They maybe are in Savannah now, because as I was starting to say, it was either 99 or 2000, Meridian opened up its first clinical trial office in Savannah. And one of their early clinical trials was for hypertension and diabetes. But, unfortunately, my mom didn't get to see that. She was only 50 when she passed. And Meridian is like Merck and some of these other big names that we hear now. They have been in business for a very long time, but when it comes to certain diseases or certain medical conditions that affect minorities, that affect a larger population than what the medical community thinks of, then they focus on those. They focus on the hypertension, they focused on the diabetes. But what I think people don't, especially a lot of Black people, don't realize is it can take up to 20 years for a drug or device or therapy to become approved. So they started with one location, and it was in an area where you could get to, but at the same time, they had to, kind of play around with the inclusion and the exclusion. So when she found trials, prior to this, they were 400 miles away, or 200 miles away. We can't get to Atlanta living in Savannah for her to get to a clinical trial. So that just sort of led me to just start, focusing more on not just my health, but the health of others, the health of my family. Diabetes runs in my family. Hypertension runs in my family. My father succumbed to both in 2009. He did. He didn't participate. You couldn't even bring anything like a clinical trial to him, because the second reason, biggest reason that a lot of minorities don't participate is the mistrust and the distrust that they have in the medical community.
Right.
And when it came to my father, he was already looking as though he wasn't receiving the treatment that he wanted, from the type of doctors he was getting that treatment from. But in his terms, the treatment was free. He knew, he knew the people, at least, even though if he didn't know what was being done. But when you bring something to us like a clinical trial, even if we can get to it, we're going to have a lot of questions. One, because we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the education, we don't have the understanding, but also the mistrust and the distrust that we have with the medical community. So that became another issue. So even though I finished with the history degree, I pretty much was still focused on that medical side. I started having various medical conditions. I have asthma. Asthma is one very misleading condition, especially when it comes to African Americans, Latinos, other minorities. They now have bigger asthma studies. I have migraines. They now are having migraine studies that now gear towards African Americans. I actually benefit from a drug that they were putting in a clinical trial about 15, 17 years ago. So when it comes to that mistrust, when it comes to that distrust, because we're not told the proper information, we've been the butt of a lot of false experiments. It makes it hard for those that are in clinical research that want to move forward, that understand the barriers, that understand the diversity and the inclusion is necessary, but because of the lack of knowledge versus our inability to believe the medical community, that's another thing that I found that made it made it really hard on finding a trial and then sticking to a trial.
So, how many trials have you attempted to be a part of, and how many trials have you been a part of?
I have attempted a total of, between 2006 and 2023, I want to say I've attempted somewhere between 8 or 9.
Okay.
I've been a part of 3 fully.
Okay.
I recently completed a full one in April of this year, which was for a COVID vaccine.
Okay.
And I started my first one in 2006, which was for a skin cream. And I can tell the difference between the verbiage that was used in 2006 versus how it has, moved forward to now in 2023.
So that verbiage I'm assuming that verbiage improved over from.
It has improved. It has improved greatly. One of the main things, especially when it comes to African Americans, when it comes to anybody with clinical trials, is education.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know what a clinical trial is, if you aren't aware of what a clinical trial is, you think that you're being treated like a lab rat.
Mm-hmm.
You have this misconception of them putting something in you that you're not aware of,
Right.
not, and then and you don't realize, and then you also think that you don't have any control. But what a lot of, especially a lot of African Americans, a lot of Latinos, a lot of people I find in general don't realize that there are laws that have been put in place because of Henrietta Lacks, because of the Tuskegee experiment, because of the Holocaust, which is what initially started all of this. The Holocaust is what brought about the Nuremberg Codes. The Nuremberg Codes basically are a set of codes and standards that clinical trials must follow. Not they have to follow, they must follow. And out of that came a lot of different things. Even though they had the Nuremberg Codes, they also didn't take into account the other community, the African American community. Does the Tuskegee experiment. But out of the Tuskegee experiment, that's where we started getting the other regulations, the Declaration of Helsinki, the different things that have happened, that the NIH, which tells us that they can't do certain things on us. We have to be respected as a person. So when you aren't aware of that, you have this misconception that you don't have the right to do anything. And you do, because the biggest thing that came out of the Tuskegee experiment, as horrific as it is informed consent. Yeah. Same thing that came out of the Nuremberg Code, but when it came to the Tuskegee experiment, it was the informed consent for respect of persons. And the informed consent can kind of be written in a weird way. Mm-hmm. So it basically the NIH and the other agencies, the FDAs, everybody is basically saying it has to be, the informed consent has to be given in a way that we can understand it. Because the advantage that they had was that a lot of the men in the Tuskegee experiment either couldn't read, they couldn't write, or they had a low educational, differential. Now,
so help people understand what is informed consent.
So, and that's what I was about. So basically, what, and that's fine. So, and like I said, because I'll keep talking, because it's very interesting when you hear the whole thing about how clinical trials start.
Yeah. No, I think you're doing a fantastic job. I just want to make sure that people are getting all of those things, the elements, and informed consent is a big part of the clinical trials, and you must sign it before you even start the trial.
Yes, you must. There's a list, a progress that all goes into informed consent. Mm-hmm. It must be written in a language that you can understand. So you can't assume that English is my first language. You must make sure that English is my first language. Spanish may be my first language or something else. It must be written in that language. It must be explained to you. You have the option to ask questions about it. You have the option to go in the informed consent, because in the informed consent, it breaks down what is going on in the trial. It tells you what type of trial you're going to be in. It tells you what procedures are going to be done. So if you have any questions, you can actually speak to the doctor, speak to the nurse, speak to the clinical research coordinator, find out, hey, is this happening? Is that happening? I'm on this particular medication, because you may read the informed consent and then find out, oh, it's perfect. I want to sign it. And then find out late, and then have a question later on and say, hey, I'm taking this type of medication. Is this experiment, or is this, well, experiment, but is this trial going to affect that? And if you feel it is, you can withdraw your informed consent, and that's it. You can sign it and then leave out of the door and call the office back 20 minutes later and say, hey, I don't want to do it. You can, if you don't sign the informed consent, nothing can be done. The informed consent has to, and all of the clinical trial has to be approved by a board before things can be done. So a lot of minorities, they don't know that there's a lot that goes into the clinical trial to make sure that you are safe, that everything, that the things that are being done with efficacy, integrity, and accurately. We've come a long ways from the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks and the Holocaust to, now our main focus is really on, or one of the main focus that clinical research I find out is really on, is on diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. I was just putting the full definition of informed consent on screen so people can, so those folks, some folks are more visual learners. I want people to understand what informed consent is. And informed consent is across all types of medical care. So you have informed consent in terms of what we're talking about tonight in clinical trials. Before you participate, they're going to have to go through it. As Selenay talked about, really, really brilliantly, just kind of talking about the different steps that they have to go through and get you to agree before they can even start in a clinical trial. You have informed consent. If you're going to have a surgery or any type of medical procedure done, they have to say, hey, you're about to have this. Do we have your consent to do this? And that's part of all types of care. And so it's not, clinical trials is one part of it, but it is part of all care, and you have to sign on. And then clinical trials is more voluntary. So it's definitely necessary. You're more likely to sign an informed consent if you have a surgery that needs to get done, if you have a blockage or something like that, cancer that needs to get operated on. You're more likely just to sign it because you want to get it done. But clinical trials are voluntary, but it's very important for you to know what the trial is about, what they're going to do, and what your participation is as part of that trial. And as Selenay mentioned, you can stop at any time, and that's part of the informed consent agreement.
Exactly. You can also include your family members. You can include your significant other. If you say you want to take the informed consent home and think about it, you have the right to do that. If you say, hey, I want to, is it okay if I let my doctor know that I'm in a clinical trial and see what my doctor thinks? You can do that. We even, one of the ways of getting clinical trials out there, especially to minorities, is to have doctors find out about them and share them with their patients. And let them know, hey, you may be suffering from asthma. You may have this particular form of cancer. So there's this type of oncology clinical trial going, and you can, even speak that information over with someone. The thing, like you said, it's voluntary. So because it's voluntary, don't be afraid to speak up and ask questions. Anything that you don't know, don't understand, need clarity on before you sign the informed consent, before you go in to that clinical trial, find all of that out. And they also, that's their job on the site level, is to make sure that you understand. They have when they write out that progress note, there's steps to that progress note that lets the sponsor know that, but not just the sponsor. If that site was to get audited, they need to know that that particular participant, on each and every participant understood verbatim what informed consent was. It's not written in doctor language, except for, the part that is involving the specific medical procedure. It's written in a language that you can understand. They even have different other forms of informed consent. Say if someone wanted to participate, but they weren't able to read well, there's different methods and different circumstances they have for that. There's different circumstances that they have informed consent for children. There's different circumstances they have if you're the mother and you want to do an informed, and there's a clinical trial for your baby. So there's all different ways that they make sure that you understand that this is completely voluntary. You can withdraw it at any time, and that you understand, and that it's in a language and it's not written in anything that's coercive or in any type of exculpatory language, or which is basically language saying that they won't be liable for this kind of,
Right.
taking it away from, on the back end.
Right. So
Just,
let me ask you this.
yes.
What were the best parts of the trials that you participated in, and what are some things that you would have changed about those trials?
So that was leading it. So your question actually led into the second biggest thing, which I was saying. And the second biggest thing that I like is each step that you go, once you've gotten into the informed consent, you've gone through the initial period, the screening visit, and now you're about to return, say, to start the treatment or do the first testing of the device. You're given, if you aren't given it at the screening visit, you're given usually at that first visit, which is a detail in educational form of each visit. What's going to happen, what you will be doing. Depending on the trial, you may be asked to take a diary home and write a diary down. Some trials, I had a clinical trial where I had to do video, especially the skin treatment, the skin cream, because the skin cream was it had a pain reliever in it. A mild pain reliever for, arthritis, which I was diagnosed at 19 and fully diagnosed at 25 with arthritis. So you had to take a video to see if there were rashes or anything. While you're going through the trial, your clinical research coordinator is going to walk you through each and every step of the trial. So there's no guessing. That was the best thing for me, is that I knew what I was doing. I knew what my next steps were. I stayed totally engaged in the clinical trial. Some of the things that I would change would be when it came to the inclusion and the exclusion. Sometimes initially, there's some clinical trials, they may do a screening. And so they do a pre-screening, like either over the phone, or they have you come in and do a pre-screening where you fill out a questionnaire. But most of them are usually done over the phone. Usually the participant will express some interest in the clinical trial, and then they'll receive a phone call with the pre-screening. And then the pre-screening, sometimes it's beneficial, but it really comes down to making sure that all of the sites are trained, that when they do the pre-screening, they're asking the right questions. Because during the pre-screening, you can feel like, oh, okay, I qualify. And then you get into the initial trial, the initial screening visit where they do the screening, and then if you pass, they do the informed consent if you pass the screening, and you find out that you don't qualify, but you find out that you could have saved yourself some time had the pre-screening been done in a particular way. One of the biggest things to pre-screening is that's where recruitment comes in. So one of the things that I think, and they're working on now, is patient recruitment. Patient recruitment, finding different ways for patient recruitment, because that's something that's going to always be an obstacle to patient recruitment.
Yeah.
Or there was a clinical trial that I had to go all the way, maybe 43 miles from my house. And they didn't realize that they needed transportation for a lot of their participants. And that was a question that they realized in hindsight they should have asked during the pre-screening, because if you didn't have transportation, it's kind of a moot point. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. They now, that same clinic, they now offer Ubers, they now offer Lyft services, but that was one thing that didn't exist when I first started in like 2006 and 2007. Well, in the early part of 2006 and the latter part of 2007, going into clinical trials.
So as we're, this is great story. Thank you so much. And I want just to point out how knowledgeable you are about clinical trials. It's amazing. I mean, you were going to informed consent and pre-screening and all of these different things that people need to know and people need to feel comfortable with in order to get involved, because we need to add our data to the larger portion.
Yes.
So if you're going to a clinical trial, we know that how many Black people have hypertension, how many Black people have diabetes. Their trials are ongoing. Getting in that get us better medication, get us better treatments, get us better outcomes. And the beautiful thing is, if you get involved in the trial, it's now out-of-pocket expense. They're not going to charge your insurance. They're not going to ask you for any checks. This is being fully funded, and you're going to get your checks. As long as you're following what they're asking you to do in terms of participation, you're going to get all of this stuff at no charge. And so that's a beautiful thing. The last question I want to ask you is, if after this show somebody sees us and somebody stops you on the street and says, Celanine, what do I need to do? Or convince me to become part of a clinical trial. What would you say to them to get them to become part of a clinical trial?
So what I would say is, one, clinical trials are not a guarantee that you're going to get better or find a therapy or have medicine that's going to be very beneficial to you. But the purpose of the clinical trials is sort of like, think of it as a medical census. If we don't participate, if we don't find out what about the trials for things that affect us, eczema, asthma, sickle cell, migraines, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, the list goes on, and even rare diseases. When it comes to rare diseases, even though a rare disease may only contribute to 3 to 5 or maybe 8% of the population, out of that is still some minorities, because we need this. We need that input. If we don't put our input in there, the Black and brown and Latino population, if we don't do that, then the medical community kind of doesn't really have a place of how to put that medication. And one day you may need that medication.
Yep.
And will you feel comfortable taking it if you knew that it wasn't treated on anyone that looked like you. You realize that when we get anything, when we get the medicine, that little brochure that goes in the medicine, that was what the makeup is. And it tells you the difference of the breakdown. And if we aren't a part of that, it's just like how the regular census was. If they can't count us, they sort of don't know how much of a percentage of a voice we make. The same thing with the clinical trials. If they can't count us, if they can't depend on us to be there to show up, then they don't know what to do with us with that medicine. And then, like I said, would you feel safe taking it if you know that it was never, exactly used on someone that looked like you?
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic discussion. I want to thank you for coming on and just really sharing somebody that's been through multiple. You said you've been through 3. You tried to get in like 8 or 9. You worked with your mother when she was going through her health conditions, trying to get her to clinical trials. So, folks, you're talking to somebody that's been there on the front lines, that understands it. As you can see from just listening to her tonight, she did the history. She read about the Tuskegee. She read about Henrietta Lacks. And then she also read about clinical trials. She learned about how they've evolved over time, from Nuremberg to informed consent to pre-screening. She said what's good about it, what needs to change, what could be better about them. This is the best resource that you can get. So I want to encourage you all, if you're watching us with us tonight, share this with your friends, share this with your family, get involved. I love what you said, Selene, about it being a medical census. I think that is the best way to describe it. Become part of the census, become part of it. Put your input into there, because your input is not only going to impact immediately, but it's going to impact future generations, because you know that whatever they're working on is going to be impactful for people that look like you. So you're not only doing it for yourself in the short term, but you're doing it for other people that look like you. I'll give you the last word, Selene.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to say you could take us home. You give us the last word. But what do you want people to really walk away with from this conversation?
So what I would like for people to walk away with, if you don't remember anything else, remember this, that we have a voice and we have to speak up, especially in the medical community. If COVID hasn't taught us anything else, the medicine doesn't affect us the same. We have to speak up. If you're interested in a clinical trial, ask your doctor, ask your physician. If you have, everybody has access to Google at one point or another, you can go on to clinicaltrials.gov and find a clinical trial that is near you. Put your information in and someone will reach out to you and find out what trials that are beneficial to you. We need to start seeing more faces that look like us show up in these trials.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. You can also go to blackdoctor.org. We have a clinical trials resource center and some partners there. There's trials that you can get involved in right there from blackdoctor.org. When you go to the homepage, just says resource center, click on that drop-down menu. It's right at the top. Click there, and you can find all about clinical trials. And the clinical trials we have on our site are specifically for conditions that are disproportionately impacting Black folks, right? So clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource. It's got all the clinical trials there. Anyone you can think of is on that registry. Come to blackdoctor.org. We've got it filtered out to stuff that's specific to Black folks as well, with some great, wonderful partners. So either way, find a clinical trial, get what you need to have done. Thank you so much, Selene.
Thank you for having me.
I didn't even care. We went overtime. It don't matter. We had to get it out. So thanks again. We'll see y'all next time here on blackdoctor.org.